Great pleasure to have with us today Roger Hardy. Roger is currently a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, working on the project The War of Ideas, the Obama administration and Muslim hearts and minds. Today, he's going to take us a step further, talking about losing hearts and minds from Bush to Obama. Roger was for 24 years a Middle East and Islamic affairs analyst with the BBC World Service. After graduating from Oxford, he worked in book publishing before joining the BBC in 1986. He has made a number of radio series about Islam in the Middle East, Europe, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. And he has turned some of his travel and experiences into a book, The Muslim Revolt, A Journey Through Political Islam. There is a copy outside, but so I would urge you to take a flyer with you and preferably order the book.
A discount.
On discount. Oh, okay. So that's very important. Roger is going to speak maybe for 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and we will leave there at least 20 to 25 minutes for our Q&A period. Welcome.
Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Wilson Center, for hosting me here. It's great being in Washington. I want to tell you a story. One day, out of the blue, a great giant of a man is attacked by a swarm of bees. They're not just ordinary bees, they're killer bees. He's stung half to death, and worse than that, the bees kill his wife and his little daughter. He storms up in a rage. He picks up the biggest stick, the biggest club he can find, and runs out chasing the bees. The killer bees are smart. The place they hide in is a beehive. They take up residence with the regular and normally peaceable honeybees. And the big giant comes in his fury, his blind fury, still feeling the stings of the bees, and he pokes his big stick into the beehive. And all the bees come out. The bees rally together. The killer bees and the honeybees. And the great giant falls to the ground in fury, in impotence, and in confusion, because for the giant, all bees look alike. Let me hit the pause button. You've not come to the wrong meeting. You've not stumbled into the District of Columbia Aviary Club. That story sums up as briefly as I am able to do so what I want to say to you today. The rest is detail. We can go to the Q&A if you like. That if my little fable convinces you, the detail may also convince you, and if it doesn't, it won't. Let me leave the bees and talk about human beings. Since 9/11, the United States and its allies, and we mustn't forget the allies. I'm not going to talk about the allies, but when I say America, I usually mean a great American-led global initiative that involves quite a lot of people, including the folk who govern or misgovern my own country. Since 9/11, that group of people have tried to do two somewhat contradictory things. to defeat the Muslims who threaten us. That's A. And B, to do so without alienating the Muslims who don't threaten us. And if you think that's simple, you're misinformed. We've spent 10 years getting that wrong. And what I want to say divides roughly equally, it will depend a bit how I manage my time, into trying to figure out whether this is a failure essentially of organization, which is bad enough, or a failure of understanding, which is worse. What I, as a journalist, mean by hearts and minds is mainly what the State Department would call public diplomacy. Diplomats do regular diplomacy and they try to influence governments. When they try to influence people's, the public opinions in a country other than your own, they call it public diplomacy. In the days of the Cold War, you had a separate outfit doing that, and it was called the USIA. And some years after the end of the Cold War, that was scrapped. Technically, it was folded into the State Department. A lot of diplomatic professionals, and I see at least two of you here today, don't care very much for propaganda. But for better or for worse, the obvious place where public diplomacy is now done, and is being done during the period of what George Bush chose to call the war on terror, is the State Department. And the problem for the State Department is, and this is well known, that it's underfunded, understaffed. Let me put it this way, it lacks the budget, the staff, and arguably the career structure to do the job. That's not simply my opinion. There have been 30-some reports on public diplomacy since 9/11. Their prescriptions differ. Their diagnosis is largely the same. Because the State Department has these handicaps, others have joined in. Now, let me add here, I'm going to talk about two players, defense and state, as if they were the only players. They are not. It's been estimated that there are more than 60 government agencies involved in one way or another with this effort, many of them in things like education and scholarship. But also under this umbrella are the soldiers and the spooks, the cops and the contractors, that army of contractors that was memorably described in the Post in that series Top Secret America. They too are in the information business, the propaganda business, and we don't have a hell of a much of an idea of what they're doing and how they're spending their money. We have clues. So I'm talking about two players, but this drama has a cast of many thousands. The Defense Department has seen a very big and, for its purposes, very painful gap and has jumped in feeling it has no choice but to try to fill that gap, and for two big reasons. It has the money to do it, and it has a very powerful motivation to do it. It's fighting two wars. And according to the current doctrine, how many of you have read the counterinsurgency doctrine? You've got to read it. According to the counterinsurgency doctrine made famous by General Petraeus, communication, in military jargon, strategic communication, is a key to success, one of the main keys to a successful counterinsurgency. Have you noticed how if you want to make something sound important, you put strategic in front of it? The one I'm fond of is strategic patience. It's obviously very different from the patience that you and I might exercise or fail to exercise because it has consequences. Strategic means consequences. Think of the mismatch in money. And for many of you, I'm telling you something you know only too well. Why do you need a British journalist to come and tell you these things? I don't think you do for many of you. Roughly speaking, unless my maths is awry, in 2011 budget terms, defense gets somewhere between $13 and $14 for every dollar that goes to state. That's state's budget with USAID. Currently $52.8 billion. Defense Department budget somewhere around $720 billion. No less striking to my innocent journalist's eye, a congressional report, not that recent, from the end of 2009, reckoned that since 9/11, from 9/11 until that point, defense had spent on strategic communication in excess of $10 billion. $10 billion. And if I was an American taxpayer, I would be asking questions about how my money is being spent. To judge from my interviews here and a fascinating day I spent, for me an extraordinary day I spent at Fort Bragg, the military are not overjoyed to be so heavily involved in the propaganda business. They tell you that they didn't choose to do it, and the more candid ones say they don't necessarily do it well. So what's gone wrong? I've begun to answer the first part of this. Is it organizational? Yes, it's organizational. I've tracked 4 serious efforts to get a strategy during the Bush administration. 4 major efforts to get a strategy that would work across the interagency process, to get everybody on board. They were not implemented. It's a failure of organization, therefore, and a failure of coordination, and a fairly sad story, which I'm not going to go into even if I wanted to, of rivalries and turf battles and differences over the nature of the task, which will take me to where I want to go in the second part. First, let me be a bit BBC here. Am I saying to you that all that money has been wasted? I am not. In virtually every interview I've done, and there have been more than 40, many on background, some taped interviews, I've asked people, did anything go right in Iraq? Has anything gone right in Afghanistan? On the hearts and minds front? The answer is that there have been successes, and many of them are unseen and unsung. Millions of dollars have gone on repairing mosques and manuscripts, on building schools and roads and bridges, on bringing young Muslims to America on scholarships. A very, very important part, and a very cost-effective part, in my view, of Hearts and Minds. But maddeningly for officials, the successes tend to count for much less than the failures. Why? Because the successes don't seriously dent the Al-Qaeda narrative. I haven't mentioned that, but I'll say just a few words about it. While the failures only serve to reinforce, unwittingly of course, to reinforce the Al-Qaeda narrative. What's the Al-Qaeda narrative? Let me just say it's quite fashionable now to say that Al-Qaeda has lost the war of ideas. The latest to say this, and I have huge respect for him, is Peter Bergen in his new book, The Longest War. I beg to differ. I think that judgment is premature, and it may even be colored by wishful thinking. Why do I think this? The Al-Qaeda narrative is strong and simple because it's a narrative of Western aggression and Muslim humiliation. By invading Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, the United States and its allies unwittingly reinforced that narrative of Western aggression, and it gets colored and orchestrated along the way. In the Iraqi case, it's just plunder. It's just an aggression designed to loot the oil. It was not, but there are many people in the Muslim world who kind of not only ready to believe that, they kind of want to believe that. It fits their psychological state. We did worse than that, and I'm not going to dwell on the horror stories. They're not forgotten, so that's why I mention them. But do I have to remind you of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib? I prefer not to do so. They reinforced big time the Al-Qaeda narrative. General Petraeus, to his great credit, described the stain of Abu Ghraib as non-biodegradable. There were other failures, and I'll touch on them. The failure to understand the societies we were invading and occupying. My friend Ali Alawi, a government minister in Iraq, refers to the, quote, alien rhetoric used by Paul Bremer's Coalition Provisional Authority. It didn't work for Iraqis. The CPA was admirably wanted to communicate with ordinary Iraqis to tell them what they were doing. And they did so in a language that was often strange and sometimes utterly meaningless for the Iraqis. Similar things have gone on in Afghanistan, I think, which I know a little bit less well. Think of the $56 billion that Congress set aside for Iraqi reconstruction. You ought to be able to win some hearts and minds with $56 billion. But one of the strange things to me as a visitor about America is that when you make a mistake, you bring in brilliant people to do an anatomy of the mistake. Real professionals. Stuart Bowen, go to his website. With the painstaking efforts of a true professional, has documented how so much of that money was lost in corruption and mismanagement. I'm a broadcaster. I'm a professional broadcaster. For most of my journalistic life, I'll say only one thing about broadcasting. In 2004, the beginning of 2004, to try and rival Al Jazeera, the most popular Arabic TV station, your authorities set up Al Hurra. What can I say? 7 years on, Al Hurra is an expensive failure. Let me turn to what some of you would like to hear, and I will do my best to be as plain speaking about this too. Has the arrival of Barack Obama made a difference? Are we now moving in another direction and a more hopeful direction? In some ways, yes. As it happened, I watched Barack Obama get elected. I have a small stake in that man. I was living in New Jersey at the time. I lived with that thirst for hope, and was it was a very remarkable experience. Also, in President Obama's defense, it's still worth reminding ourselves, okay, he's had 2 years in office, and yes, he's made mistakes. I may refer to some of them, but he still inherited what The Economist a few weeks back called the in-tray from hell. The legacy was toxic, and the place where it was most toxic was the greater Middle East. And yes, the Cairo speech made a difference. The Cairo speech was the counter-narrative, the counter to the Al-Qaeda narrative. It was persuasive. Muslims who welcomed the speech, however, and they did, have now had time to look at what the president has done and not done, and they're disappointed. For those of you who want to follow this, there's a very, very good report. It's the best thing of its kind by two real experts in this field. It's called America's Extended Hand, Assessing the Obama Administration's Global Engagement Strategy. Go to the website of the Center for a New American Securities, just across the road from us, as it happens on Pennsylvania, cnas.com. If you want the nitty-gritty, the phrase that a journalist like me will pick out would be, which reflects, they're not at all unsympathetic to what the president's been trying to do. But in their judgment, and I think it's fairly widely shared in this town, he overpromised and underdelivered. I think they've found that when it comes to the war on terror, I'm going to go on using that term, though the President and the officials do not. The legacy, I think, of the Bush era is stronger than they had expected it would be. And if we remember that there was a significant shift, I think, between the second term of George Bush and the first term. The neocons had had their day, and the more pragmatic people, Bob Gates, Ryan Crocker in Baghdad, a whole string of people, a more pragmatic group of people began to try, how shall one put it, a bit of damage limitation. Therefore, the continuities between the second term, Bush's second term, and the first 2 years of Barack Obama are quite striking, particularly in the counterterrorism, counterinsurgency area. Yes, this administration has tried to clean up so many things. It's been determined, and this comes clearly from the President down, that they want to fight the war on terror, or whatever else you want to call it, within the rule of law. And they have agonized over how you do this, what you do with Guantanamo, what you do, this whole tangle of legal things that are not resolved. This is not entirely their fault, but, and I've done a little bit of homework on this, can we be absolutely sure that torture has ended, even though the President has issued clear marching orders to that effect? If you want an example, and I came across it through a law professor friend, look at the recent Open Society report on the abuse of detainees at Bagram Air Base. Not under the last administration, under this administration. I want to end with something that is so basic, and is more basic than the organizational things I've talked to, the mistakes that were made in X, Y, and Z. There are two issues. Well, there are three issues, but I can't talk about them all, but I can put them on the table anyway, that still kind of lurk there, regardless of the change of administration. One of these seems to me the central one, but let me mention all three. Even now, almost a decade after 9/11, in my judgment, the United States still does not understand its enemy and the world its enemy inhabits. Is the enemy Islamism in general, as a whole bunch of people will say in this town and in Europe too? Or is it, as I would argue, the violent Islamism of Al-Qaeda? Second, are we fighting to bring democracy to the Muslim world? Or not? Events in Tunisia and yesterday in Egypt make this an urgent question, and it was not an accident or a last-minute addition, I think, that the President in his State of Union address so warmly welcomed people power in Tunisia. And third, is the Israeli-Palestinian issue central to all this, or a kind of red herring? Well, the administration has argued that this issue is a strategic threat to the interests of the United States, a statement that caused a throb on the blogosphere. But General Petraeus also said the same thing. But having proclaimed its centrality, they then fumbled the issue itself. They have badly mishandled the issue, which slightly spoils the effect of saying it's so important, we're putting it right up high on our agenda. We need to understand Islam and Islamism both. I wrote my little book and it's very short, it won't take you long, whatever its merits or demerits, because I thought that a journalist using journeys and interviews and meetings and local colour could maybe help to explain this thing which still maddens and mystifies policymakers and the general public. We need to understand Islam and Islamism and bin Ladenism, three things really. And the climate in Europe and here, especially since your 9/11 anniversary, is not conducive to understanding. It's fevered, it's polarized. If it's not, what was his name, Pastor Jones in Florida, it's Newt Gingrich, and now more recently it's Jim Woolsey and Frank Gaffney, and I'm sorry to say you can find this book quite freely and download it on the internet, should you so wish, Sharia, the Threat to America. And the people who argue this argue entirely speciously, in my view, that Sharia has already conquered Europe, a place where I have done some work within the Muslim communities over some years, and is now poised to conquer America. To give you just one element of the flavor of this book, they describe the Sharia, the body of Islamic law, as I quote, a totalitarian socio-political doctrine, unquote. Comparable, they make absolutely clear in the introduction to this tome, comparable to communism and Nazism. We need to get real. This is not communism or fascism all over again. This is not World War III. What do I think drives Islamism? Many things, but I want to highlight one which seems to me at its core. Islamism is a new form of anti-imperialism. And in that respect, the Islamists have seized the banner that only a few generations ago was carried aloft in the greater Middle East and beyond by the nationalists. The enemy then was European colonialism. The enemy now is you. You are the most reluctant imperialists on this planet. But it is not simply a perception, this is my judgment anyway, it is not thus that Muslims see you as the new imperial power. You are the new imperial power. And when the Predator drone comes over, one guy doesn't say, "Oh, Mohammed, don't worry, they're suffering from imperial overstretch." I don't think so. That's what you worry about here. It's not what they see, they feel and perceive, nor is it what they are told by opportunistic imams, politicians, populists, their equivalent of the Tea Party, who want to paint you in the darkest colours and want to rally Muslims to their lousy causes. And you are then also tied to a bunch of corrupt autocratic regimes in the Muslim world, many of whom you need for all sorts of purposes, and their failings become your failings. I ought to correct myself and say their failings become our failings. We in Europe did not handle ourselves with glory in the Tunisian affair. Like it or not, the United States is the new imperial power, and no public diplomacy campaign, however skillful, however well-funded, however imaginative, is going to change that. Changing the perception will require changing the reality. I look forward to your questions and comments, and you can even ask me why I'm wearing such a ridiculous tie if you're so moved.
Thank you. Can I have a mic here? Aaron David Miller, please.
Actually, my voice hopefully will.
Okay. But we need to tape it. So just be patient for 30 seconds. She's coming from the back. Okay.
Thanks. Roger, it's a fascinating presentation. You've identified all kinds of things, implicit, explicit criticism of American policy, and I don't want to take issue with any of that. I simply want to make two comments by the way of perspective. Number one, hearts and minds seems to me not to be the right order of things. It's minds and hearts. It's always been about minds and hearts. And while I don't think it's realistic or feasible to change American policy across the board, just by changing the wrapping on a package without changing the contents isn't going to change much about our profile in this region. People aren't stupid. it's not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash of interests. And our interests, for any number of reasons, some legitimate and some not, are at odds on many different issues with Arab and Muslim regimes from one end of the region to the other. And short of a wholesale recalibration of American policy toward authoritarian Arab regimes, toward our military deployments, toward the Arab-Israeli issue, we're not going to change a lot of hearts and minds. Second, in defense of our position, is one basic reality, which you know as a Brit better than anyone. This region is littered with the remains of great powers who believed wrongly they could impose their will on what are essentially small tribes who grapple with political and physical survival on a daily basis. That is not our fate. We're not an imperial power. We have two oceans and weak neighbors. We don't have an imperial class. The Brits exported 30 million people during the course of their empire to run it. Most Americans, that's not the way they operate. We are stuck, sadly, and finally, in an investment trap. We can't fix this region. Tunisia, Lebanon, what's happening in Egypt seems to the Palestinian WikiLeaks. All of these are domestic issues driven by forces in large part beyond our control. We can't fix the region, and yet we can't extricate ourselves from it. That's the problem we face. And I wish I had a solution.
No, one by one. Yeah. Right.
I'm in agreement with a lot of what you say, but not quite all of what you say. In a sense, we share our pessimism because the whole thrust of what I've been saying is that I'm sorry to go back to the bees again, but I mean it's like the guy on the floor and he's just annoyed all the bees. It's like he jumps up, and he kind of sees that he's now got two lots of enemies, and he shouts out to the honeybees, said, "Don't worry, I like you." It doesn't work. He's a big guy and he's still wielding the big stick. Anyway, in that sense, it's difficult to extricate yourself, and for all the various reasons you've given. It doesn't mean that something better is not possible, because my working assumption is this: you don't want to be an imperial power, and that applies in the United States from the president down. He didn't want this job to run a neo-imperial structure, or what, we can debate the words, but let's put it more narrowly. He doesn't want to occupy countries when the occupation of those countries is costing huge amounts of money, and when the priority, as all of you know much better than me, is to sort out America's domestic problems, its economic problems, its healthcare. These were the things he wanted to be president to do. Maybe a small part of, I am not trying to put figures on this, maybe those who, how shall I say, who most favored the Iraq misadventure still think that the projection of power is the way to work. Aggressive self-defense, whatever you want to call it. Read the memoirs of Douglas Feith. I spent an hour with Mr. Feith. But I don't think most Americans share that, and I think most of them are, how shall I put it, chastened by the Iraq experience. One final thing. I'm actually asking you to do nothing other than what you say you want to do. Nothing. I repeat that. It sometimes appears like when you say to a certain crowd, you've got to make Israeli-Palestinian peace a priority. And this has happened to the president to a certain extent. A certain group of people will get all defensive and say, oh, you want to sacrifice Israel on the altar of winning of fighting these insurgencies and fighting the extreme Muslims. Nothing of the kind. If we want to do it anyway, well, the fact that it's a tremendous recruiting tool for al-Qaeda and its extended family is another extremely good reason for doing what we have already 1,001 reasons for wanting to do. And the same applies across the board. I'm not pretending that the democracy issue is easy. Funnily enough, and I'm looking at Alan Gulty as I say this, while I have over the years had some differences with the British Foreign Office, not least on terminology, I'm with them on this one. The favoured term in London is governance. It's the right term. Governance and the rule of law is what these countries need. Only with those as building blocks can you meaningfully move towards some sort of democratization. And that's part of the mistake in Iraq. You cannot parachute in democracy. Comparisons between yourselves and the British Empire, that's my granddad's generation, Aaron. I'm not carrying that burden that my granddad bore. Sure, it's different now. The point really is that when you occupy countries, you're deemed to impose yourselves upon them. And as Ryan Crocker likes to say, one of your wisest diplomats, I think, be careful of what you get into and be even more careful of what you get out of.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic and
Thank you, Ali. Dave Rogers, independent scholar. Sir, you probably saw that article in the Post a couple of days ago of Seymour Hersh shooting his mouth off about the military's crusader mentality and the influence of evangelicals on the military and all of that. How would you assess the accuracy of Hersh's assertion?
I didn't read it. No doubt I should have done. But if it's about the militarization of your foreign policy, I don't know if that's what he was arguing. But a lot of people in this town are worried about what is in effect the militarization of your foreign policy. They are right to be worried. No, I'm not. I'm not going to go down the mentality of the Crusader mentality road. I don't buy that.
Henry, please, here, please. Yes. Just wait. Yeah, thank you.
Henry Precht, retired imperialist. You've talked about 10 times about the Middle East as President Clinton did last night. And I think it's significant that the other 57 minutes of domestic policy discussion is really the crux of the problem. Because if he begins to do some of the things you would probably like to see him do on Arab-Israel front, maybe allowing a Muslim group to take over in Tunisia or in Egypt, what's going to happen to his domestic agenda? He was lucky that he didn't have the Israeli problem on the agenda when he took up health care. He may never have gotten health care legislation. The next 2 years will be heavily burdened by what he does in the Middle East. Or don't you agree?
I think so. And I regard that as a comment and a contribution rather than a question that I might want to disagree with. I agree with you. Wasn't it interesting that he was eloquent, fulsome on Tunisia and didn't mention Egypt? Because that goes to the nub of it. Egypt is far more important than Tunisia, far more important to the United States, to the region, to Europe. Now, if you look at the Times today, there was a gloss on his phrase, and we support freedom everywhere, and some official anonymously told the Times, brackets Egypt. That's as close as he got. It's not very close. I'm not saying it's easy. When you guys have worked as diplomats, it reminds me of my daughter. When she wants some money from me, she will not come up and tell me I'm a lousy dad. When we want something from the Egyptians or the Saudis, we really want something bad. We don't go up and say, you're a lousy, corrupt regime. We try and sweet-talk them to get what we want. And just as we're leaving the door, we say, couldn't you do something about women's rights? And that's probably the best that unlucky person felt they could do. We're in a bad place.
Hi, I'm Mel Loeffler. I'm a scholar here at the Wilson Center. I very much agree with much that you've said here today. But in many ways, I think you're telling us the easy things. And most polls, indeed almost all the polls of Arab public opinion, confirm that Arabs dislike the United States because of American policies, not because of American values. So it's the policies that ostensibly need to be changed. But the policies themselves are based on, as Aaron Miller just said, assessments of interests. The major policies that are always identified relate to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute and the American quest for oil in the region. That's the way it's perceived. So the United States for, 40 years has been trying to solve in one way or another, sometimes with moderate success, sometimes with notable failures, the Palestinian-Israeli problem. What I would like to know is what policies and what interests need to be reshaped and how you would reshape them, because it's the policies that need to be changed. I think we all know that, but it's not easy to change those policies. So what are you really telling us? Which policies should be changed? How should they go about being changed? Help us grapple with these issues.
Go back to the Cairo speech, and it's virtually all there. And as the speechwriter, Ben Rhodes, who wrote a large part of it, said in a briefing I went to, we put our own checklist into the speech. I'm not calling on President Barack Obama to do one single thing that he had not himself gone to Cairo and presented in that what Ben Rhodes calls the checklist. We can do, he offered this, it was such a good phrase, and it's still such a good phrase. Mutual interest, the word you picked up, and mutual respect. The two things are not the same and they don't balance. You know what, Muslims? Often people want the non-tangible things which mean a lot to them. They want things for their lives and for their kids, all the things that we all want. He offered them mutual respect and mutual interest. And for a moment, I think they wanted to believe it. And they believed that he was sincerely offering it to them, which I believe also. But they don't feel they're getting mutual respect. The interest part I could talk about, this president it's hugely important to him to look for common ground here in America, and his own background contributes to this. Look for where your interests come together, even with your enemies. But mutual respect is tough. I'll just add a phrase to this. President Obama can't stop Pastor Jones from threatening to burn the Quran, which that single thing by an obscure guy with a flock of nothing whom nobody had ever heard of was taken as American disrespect by Muslims. And this is not an entirely irrational response. Muslims don't know who Pastor Jones is. Who are they more likely to believe? The eloquent president who goes to Cairo and makes a kind of offer, puts down a kind of, this could be the basis of a new relationship. Or a crazy guy who jumps up and very nearly does it. I mean, we're lucky that he never actually burnt the Quran. I'm agreeing with practically all of you who've asked me questions. This is tough. I don't have a hardy plan in my back pocket. Do this, do that, do that. But the Cairo speech is a damn good plan.
Roger, yes, then, but I have a bit of problem with understanding some of your argument. Namely, when you talk about the region, you also must remember that over 50% of the region is under the age of 30. And if you go around and talk to these people, the younger generation, and you ask them, which country in the world would they like to live if they had a chance to leave the hellhole they were stuck in? They would say America. If America is the imperialist, evil place that maybe the other 50% believes? Why haven't they succeeded, the Islamists, to indoctrinate their younger generation? I mean, explain that to me.
It's a paradox that's more apparent than real. What example can I give you? I'm not a huge fan of US foreign policy in the Greater Middle East. I think you may have figured this out by now. I'm a huge fan of the movies of John Ford. Why should that seem to be a contradiction? Many Muslims, not only in the Greater Middle East, but well beyond the Greater Middle East, think that your foreign policy is, let me quote an ambassador, a former ambassador, who's not a million miles from the room in which we sit. They think America is inimical to their interests. That word, interests, is inimical. They think that. And various things that actually do happen, they're not imaginary, reinforce their thinking that. So human beings think at different levels without any difficulty. We all do it. And I think that's what's happening. And the same parents who think your foreign policy is entirely misguided want to send their kids to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton if only they had the chance to do so. A contradiction? No, it's a seeming contradiction.
Mike is.
Yes, Roger, thank you for this. It'd be very difficult to disagree with most of what you said, and as you know, we've talked about it. I guess I'd like to push you a little further on the subject of your reference to what should he have said about Mubarak. And going back to what Hale said, are we sort of to dedicate a new policy in the region toward this new generation? Are we to say that the old guard is really no longer of interest to us? The difference between Tunisia and Egypt is Tunisia has gone through a sort of the beginnings of a revolution, of a change. Egypt is not there yet, although some would hope it would happen. At what point does supporting Tunisia sound like we're supporting democracy, and supporting opposition to Mubarak sound like the imperial power undoing a government? Obama is in a, as you pointed out, in a difficult situation. But I guess looking forward, it does seem to me that he has a particular problem in how he deals with governments. And whether one likes it or not, we deal with the governments that are there.
It's a fair question. I've given it some thought, and I don't pretend it's anything other than difficult. Let me be as straight as I can. Should he have even implied in the speech, the State of the Union, that he'd be happy to see the downfall of Hosni Mubarak? He could not do that, and I would not expect, if I were in a position to advise, God help me and God help them, I would not advise that. Look at what Hillary did in Doha. More subtle. At the end of a trip round the Gulf, she really let rip. By far the most outspoken thing that has come out of this Obama administration. She attacks corruption. It's largely a business audience. So she presents it in business terms. She lays it on thick. If you have a big project in this part of the world, you go and pay this guy, you go and pay this guy, and you think, how long is this going to go on? She goes on, and this guy, and at the end, Now, everybody in the audience knows that the political elite and the business, she doesn't come in there and say, your governments are rubbish, are tyrannical, and they got to go. But she did say, this region is in danger of sinking into the sand. Wow. Now, again, I hope I'm not naive. Where do you go from that with a speech? Are you going to do more of that? We remember. You mentioned Egypt. You remember what happened with Condi. Condi Rice went to Egypt. It was the high point of the Bush freedom agenda, and she gave them hell. And they didn't know how to take it. They didn't know what to do. But they waited it out. And the freedom agenda fizzled. When she went back, she didn't talk in the same way again. Autocrats have learned to wait it out, to make largely symbolic concessions. Events will determine whether the Tunisian example, it's already it's already affected, I was going to say infected, not quite the right word. It's already had a ripple effect in terms of the mood. I don't think regimes will fall like dominoes, but we don't really know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen in Tunisia. So how policymakers respond will depend very much on how this plays out.
Yes, in the back, please. Can you wait for the mic? Yes, thank you.
Tobias Voss, Straight Counsel. Given the utility of having a clear enemy of sorts to identify for politicians in this country, a clear outside enemy, and one that will, moreover, allow the security services and armed forces to stay relevant, what is in it for the politicians to actively try to solve the problems through peaceful means? Sorry if that verges on a conspiracy theorist's question, but...
Oh, there's very powerful reasons for trying to deploy soft power to greater effect, or what Hillary likes to call smart power. It's cheaper. It's a hell of a lot cheaper. And if you can do it without your own young men and young women being killed, or the young women and young men of Britain or Canada or some other place, hey, that's a pretty good additional reason. You know, I believe Bob Gates when he says, I'm ready to give money from the Pentagon budget to those guys in the State Department to try and do a better job with public diplomacy. I believe him. He made that speech, now correct me if I'm wrong, 3 years ago? This is the Seymour Hersh article, which I have not read, but I don't buy this notion that your military is thirsting for new enemies and has a crusader mentality, if that's the term that Sy-Hersh moved. No one feels imperial overstretched. You may accept or not accept that term more than your military. They're the ones who are overstretched. Yes, the budget is overstretched. They found it extremely hard to fight two difficult counterinsurgencies simultaneously when they were both. They're now it's kind of now 1.5 insurgencies. The Iraqi one is really on the back foot. That's bad enough. You're the American superpower. It would be, people like to think they can do almost anything that their country and their president requires them to do. It's not so. I just don't see it in this kind of deterministic way, or the kind of way that you were implying.
Last question here, please. Yes. Let's take 2 questions together. Here, yes, and then there in the back. Sure.
Hi, Wendy Lewis from the Foundation for a Civil Society. You said at the beginning that there is a lack of structure in the State Department, and as far as public diplomacy, or however one wants to call it, and the huge amounts of money that have been spent both by state and certainly by DOD and the others. How would you go about, I mean, I know this is a really difficult question, but how would you go about, especially when they're now reviewing our whole development policy as well in a week or so, what steps would you take even in the beginning to utilize some of Gates's money to begin to get people in embassies and other structures? I mean, that seems to be the problem. We've failed so miserably so far.
Thank you. And the lady in the red there? Yes.
My name is Tish King. I'm from the Broadcasting Board of Governors that oversees all U.S. international broadcasting, and I wanted to share a point of information and then an illustration of that. My point of information is about Al-Hurra and its success in the region, where it is increasingly cited as a reliable source of news by the media in the region, and in Iraq alone reaches more than 60% of the adults. And let me give you an example.
Could I have your question, please? We are running out of time.
Sure. In reference to the question of broadcasting and its role in this, the story of Pastor Jones was covered at length on Al-Hurra by bringing in other religious leaders to to decry the defamation of someone else's sacred text. I just think it's important for a point of information.
Thank you.
Okay, two important questions. In the interviews I've done, I detect broadly two approaches to try and solve the problem that you refer to. Basically, either to try and keep it within state, keep public diplomacy within the State Department and just make it work, which involves the chain of command. Our public affairs officers working for the Undersecretary, currently Judith McHale, or for the ambassador wherever they are. Because if it's for the ambassador wherever they are, she doesn't have a chain of command. And she's supposed to drive an interagency process and do all sorts of things. And she lacks the staff, the money, and the chain of command to do that. This is a long-running problem. And everyone who's come into that, frankly, thankless post has looked at it and tried one thing or another. Maybe if I was at the BBG, maybe I'd be saying what you're saying. Look, this is not my opinion only about Al-Hurra. The opinions that matter are the opinions of Arabs. I talk to Arabs and I talk to Arab journalists. That's their judgment.
Please join me in thanking Roger for a wonderful, provocative talk.